Welcome to Charity Therapy, a podcast from Birkin Law about building better nonprofits. I'm your host, Jess Birkin. Hello, and welcome to this episode of Charity Therapy. Today, I am joined by Kris Kewitsch. Full disclosure, Kris and I work together at Charities Review Council, where I am a board member, and she is our kick-ass executive director. Thanks for joining me, Kris.
Thanks for having me, and I love starting the day with being told I'm a kick-ass executive director. I will take that every day.
That's not just for show tunes either. That's like for real. She really does kick ass. And it sounds like Kris bought a house and is in a new neighborhood where they're like building stuff as we speak. So if you hear a little hammering in the background, it's the neighbor's house getting built. So don't worry about it. Nobody's knocking on your door.
Nope. I am totally focused here. They're just building and building and building across the street.
There you go. So. It's going to be great when it's done.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so Kris, I wanted to have you on the podcast today because, you have that unique position of both being an executive director at a nonprofit and helping other nonprofits improve their governance practices, amongst other things. So today I've got some questions lined up about governance and the relationship between the board and the executive director. And I'm hoping before we kind of dig in that you would share your number one tip for having a good relationship with your board.
Number one tip, open lines of communication and transparency and vulnerability. I think just remembering that while your board of directors is your boss, they're your partners, and that the organization can't do what it does without having those folks be your partner. And so being willing to share the good, the challenging, and even if there's ugly, making sure that you take them on as partners and think of them as partners instead of someone to be afraid of or bosses, or sometimes not have all the answers when you're talking with your board of directors because they have lots of wisdom and experience they want to share.
Yeah, I love that. That's so great. I feel that with you. I feel like lines of communication are good. So you're eating your own dog food, as they say. What a terrible expression that is. But yes, you are walking the talk. I don't even know. There's a lot of bad expressions about that, but I love it. All right.
There are, aren't there?
I know, yeah. Right? I'm like, ooh, I can't even think of a good one.
I'd rather walk the talk than eat the dog food.
Eat your own dog food? So gross.
I'll eat my cooking.
Maybe
do that a lot.
Let's do that. So. Eat your own cooking. That sounds better. I don't know. Okay. Well, anyway, right. Idioms and expressions aside, let's dig right in with our first question. Here we go. I'm the executive director of a nonprofit. I've been with the org for 6 years. That's longer than anyone else on the board at this point. I have basically been running the organization by myself for the last few years. The board is kind of just a formality. They meet about once a year to vote on a budget that I've prepared and get an update on things. I do communicate with my president via email more often, usually about quarterly. I know this isn't the right way for us to operate. How can I engage my board members better and make sure they are governing the nonprofit? Holy buckets. There's a lot. Yep. There's a lot going on here.
We can unpack a few things inside of that question. So we started with partnership. It feels like there's not a whole lot of partnership between that executive director and their board of directors. I think it sounds like there's a little more partnership with the president, but I think the big opportunity is to think about how many meetings you have and how you work to engage them in what you're doing. Because for organizations legally, right, one board meeting a year, they're required. We, as the Charities Review Council, our standard requires 4 meetings a year.
Yeah.
I think getting them together more often would be helpful. I also think One of the things that we do at the council, and right now it's every 2 weeks, is a weekly update, bi-weekly update to board members about what's going on, seeing if you can get them more engaged in what's going on with the organization. The other piece is there's an opportunity, if you look at your bylaws and see how many members you have, to recruit more members, new members who might be more engaged as board members for the organization. So one of the things that, pre-COVID and pandemic and staying at home was trying to connect one-on-one with each of the board members at least once a year, right? So how do you have relationship with those folks? How do you create those open lines of communication? So if you're going to I would start with a conversation with each of those board members, ask them why are they on the board? What do they get out of being on the board? And what would they like to contribute as a board member? And gather all that information and then figure out what your next steps are, whether it's communicating differently, changing your meeting schedule, recruiting new members.
Yeah, they don't say this in their question, but I wouldn't be surprised to find out that this executive director is also our charismatic founder who had the original vision. And just because they've been there the longest and they're the ED and they're running everything, that kind of all adds up to me that this is a founder. And maybe that board was sort of not engaged appropriately from the beginning because this person just really wanted to deliver the mission and they knew they had to have a board. Like I run into that a lot where it's like, well, I've got these, my cousin and my friend and this other person who will like be my board. And they're not really invested in the mission. They're just sort of like, yeah, I'll do this thing for you. And, from kind of reading between the lines with how many startups I've worked with, that feels like that might be what's going on here. And this ED may be starting to get burned out, carrying all, like, that's a heavy load. And that's what I tell them when they're like, well, I can do this. I'm like, yeah, maybe you want to find people who actually care about the mission, though, because you can't just do it all on your own forever. And so it may be that as you're having those conversations that Kris mentioned, that you're going to realize that you do need to recruit new people in and you need to like bring some new energy in, because maybe those people have just been there to be like a rubber stamp for you. And that's not real governance. And it's hard to turn people from a rubber stamp into a passionate, engaged board member. That's my take.
I also would look at your term limits and see if you have term limits.
Yeah, right. I was like, right. What term limits is my guess, right? Like, it's probably time to come in for a bylaws revision. My number is 612. No, just kidding. But yeah,
I would say, term limits are so important because then folks know that they have a discrete period of time during which they're going to serve, and they're more likely to be engaged during that window. But I would agree, it sounds like it's probably a founder. And in the beginning, founders are so energized by getting it all started that by year 6, you're like, I can't push this rock up a hill by myself anymore.
Yeah.
And so that recruitment piece is incredibly important because the reality is you'll find people who love what you're doing and want to help you do what you're doing. And those folks will be amazing board members who will be your partners in running that organization.
Right. And if those people don't exist, then we have to really consider whether this is a mission that can be delivered, or whether it needs to be delivered some other way through another organization that has more resources around it or something like that. So those are all good things to think about. Okay.
Yeah.
Let's move on.
All right. Hit me.
I I just got hired on as the ED for a small nonprofit 3 months ago, and I've had a really hard time managing the relationship with my board. They're all great people and really well-meaning, but honestly, they're making it hard to do my job. The entire board of 9 people wants to be involved with every little decision I make, large or small, and I can't spend anything more than $50 without prior approval. We end up deliberating over every little thing for weeks, and I know it's hurting the nonprofit's potential. How can I improve this dynamic without offending the board members? I genuinely want what's best for the nonprofit and our mission.
Eek.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Painful. That is painful.
It sounds like they might be their first ED.
Yes.
Is what I would read between the lines there, that the board was used to doing everything, and now they have someone who can do something, and they haven't yet relinquished the reins to that individual in their role. So I think that the opportunity comes around to think about board responsibilities, having a conversation around what is management and operations versus governance. And I think there is an opportunity to help keep them involved in knowing what the decisions are, but having that clarity of who's responsible for which pieces would be really important. And especially, the spend anything more than $50 without prior approval. If the board has approved a budget, then the executive director should be able to spend to that budget. There are certain dollar thresholds, whether it's $2,000, $5,000, $10,000, that an executive director should be able to spend to. Our board at Charities Review Council approved a budget. I spend that budget, but there are large enough expenses that I actually need co-signature with them. So you can put those internal controls in place. And I think having the conversation around what kind of internal controls are in place.
Yeah.
The budget is the first place to start. And then having conversation around management, operations decisions versus governance decisions.
My guess is if they're nickel and diamond over every $50 spend, we probably don't have a budget, because they're really paying attention to every dollar as it goes out, because they don't actually know what's going on in the big picture. So I agree, like really taking the opportunity to frame this as the struggle here for a new ED, especially with a board that's never gone through this process, or maybe went through it in a blaze of glory with a previous failed ED or something, is trying to navigate telling them what to stay in their lane without ruining the relationship, right? And making that transition can be really challenging, especially like where we're sitting in Minnesota when you have a lot of indirect communicators.
Oh, Minnesota. Interesting.
I know. But one of the ways to tackle that is to start, just like you said, getting those financial policies and procedures in place and being able to cite like neutral third-party sources for why that's a good idea, and helping to start educating your board around why we need to do this. Oh, this is going to free you up, make it a win for them, right? We spend a lot of time discussing these things. That's a big time waster. We could be doing other things. Let's go ahead and agree we're going to set a budget. Let's agree we're going to set a financial policy and procedure. Then once you get them on board with some of that stuff, or if you can't, bring in somebody to do a board training, right? Because this board needs to learn what its role is now that they have a staff person. And that just can be hard to do on your own as an ED, trying to tell everybody, hey, you hired me and now I'm going to tell you how to do your job.
Right. You're my boss, and let me tell you how to do your job as my boss, right? Yeah. I think when you look at, there's so many organizations nationally, locally, to support that work for organizations, Propel for nonprofit, Board Source, even the Attorney General's office has information on what really should a board be focused on? What are their responsibilities, and what are their fiduciary responsibilities? And I would say to organizations, consider taking a look at we can be your third party resource, our accountability standards. You can bring those to any board conversation that you want to tee up as a third party way as an executive director, or even as your board. If you're needing to have some conversation with your ED, either way, they're a great frame for conversation. And I think the other piece is figuring out what those board members have to offer. So kind of giving them something else to focus on. So if you have a board member who's an HR expert, ask them to be involved and engaged in the HR work. If you have somebody who's around technology, have them be focused on technology. So give them something to do that lightens your load so that they can continue to feel like they're contributing. Because sometimes board members don't know how to be good board members, and they assume that kind of oversight is them being strong, active, engaged board members. So it is that education piece and then also the engagement piece.
Yeah, I love that advice. That is great advice. Okay, let's move on to our third question. We are a very small nonprofit with about 8 staff. Oh, honey, that's actually pretty big. I know, right? I'm like, 8 staff. You need to course correct there. You're pretty big compared to some of my clients. All right. Anyway, we're a small nonprofit with about 8 staff. I'm the executive director, and the time has come where I need to do something about our board president. She treats all the staff, including me, terribly. She's demanding and rude, even though she's pretty new and should be trying to learn how we operate. Our accountant quit because of her, and another board member has left, though I don't know for sure it's about the president. Is there anything I can do? I don't want to quit. I love my job, and I don't want to leave my employees in the lurch. Woof. That's fun.
That focus takes a whole lot of time away from the mission of the organization, which is really unfortunate for that executive director to be spending time trying to manage that relationship. I guess first and foremost, what are your term limits? What are the terms for your officer roles as an organization? Is there a time when she's just going to roll off? And then that attrition would lead to someone else's leadership naturally without having to necessarily move her off the board. If there aren't terms for that role, that would be something to try to get in place. And then the other piece is, as you consider terms, try to make sure that you're cultivating relationships with enough of the board members that there would be someone who would step up to take her place as the next president, because that doesn't always happen naturally, and it takes time to help someone see themselves in that role, and for you to have conversation as executive director with those folks about what would it look like to be the next president of that board.
Yeah. This definitely starts to get into some of that, what I call the survivor island tactics, where you need to start making strategic alliances through those open lines of communication with your other board members. The other thing that pops for me is a lot of times there's this sense that because board members are volunteers, they're sort of exempt from having to follow all the HR and employment law kind of stuff. And that somehow if they're behaving badly in the workplace, that can't be addressed. And I think that's garbage. We definitely want to have good policies in place that protect our employees from harassment and just bad behavior. And so one thing this ED could consider is, as a staff of 8, perhaps it might be time to take a look at our HR policies and procedures and making sure that those things apply to all supervisors, including our board, and then starting to like deal with those things. Because what you don't want to have happen is you have some employment law problem because of a board member's conduct. And also it's fair to, apply your code of conduct and your policies and stuff to the board when they interact with your staff.
Definitely.
I can't even imagine a reality where that would come up for me at the council, but I know that you would not let it go if that was a thing, right?
No. So a couple of things. Our board and our staff annually sign a whole slew of policy, conduct and ethics, conflict of interest, whistleblower policies. We also have a board member agreement form, which basically details for board members how they will contribute to the organization over the course of the year, and then what the organization is committed to providing each of the board members for their term. And I do think that there is an opportunity to have conversation around having the board hold itself accountable to each other, right? So rather than as an executive director having to have these conversations solely with the president, how do you leverage the rest of the board to hold that other board member accountable to their behavior as well? So you can kind of come at it from both sides.
Totally. Man, we've dropped some serious value bombs on people here today, and I just want to take a minute to recap some of what I think are the best nuggets here. First, just going all the way back to the beginning, those open lines of communication between the ED and the board cannot be overstated. That's so important. And then, on the recruitment side, getting folks around you in the organization who truly actually care about the mission and are willing to be engaged is really important for the organization and for the ED, frankly. And then getting a sense of what board members actually want to contribute and why they're on the board, right? So like for me at the council, I was like, I don't want to be the lawyer. I want to help with program stuff. I'd lawyer all day long. That's what I do for my job. And you were very cool with that, which I appreciated, right? So not assuming what people want to do on the board, but learning and having those open lines of communication. Oh my God, so Minnesotan. Open. We're going to have those open lines of communication there, Kris, eh?
Where we have toast on an orbo.
Oh, yeah. It snowed today. Okay, anyway.
Sorry.
And then back to serious topics. Navigating, every board is going to have some like misapplied energy. And sometimes that's overreach or sometimes that's misapplied energy just from excitement about things. And helping them learn about what their role is and identifying ways that they can apply their skills and expertise that help you as the ED, right? So how can you rechannel some of that stuff in ways that helps you? And then finally, I think that last bit about don't forget to include your board in your policies and procedures when it comes to HR and employment law stuff. Board members are not exempt from issues that come up with staff. Just because they're volunteers doesn't mean we shouldn't take their behavior seriously at work.
And the last is making sure that there is an outlined policy for how staff and board interact with each other.
Yes, I love that.
Right. So that if the accountant quit because of her, it does make me question if the board president was going directly to staff and bypassing the executive director.
Right. Which is not appropriate, FYI.
And I love when you, Jess, as our board member, talk to our staff about something, but usually I am either in the conversation or I know for sure that I have given the okay for you all to work independently of me to make something happen.
Yeah, that would just be weird. Like, I don't understand board members that do that. Like, don't do that.
Yeah, no, don't do that.
Well, Kris, thanks so much for being here. If folks want to connect with you and learn more about you and what the Charities Review Council does, where can we find you online?
Best way to find me is Kris@smartgivers.org. check out our website, smartgivers.org. I'm on all social media platforms. And if you're active in social media, feel free to follow us on LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. We have lots of content that we publish, both talking about our accountability standards and how to leverage those, and also curating content from across the sector. So,
amen to that.
Yeah.
Folks, if you enjoyed this episode, do me a huge favor, share it with a friend, rate and review in your podcast app. It really helps me out. If you have a question or a story to share, I'd love to hear from you. Send me a note online at charitytherapy.show or leave a voice memo by calling 612-208-9120. Thanks for listening. All right, folks, that's our show. Be sure to follow me on Instagram or Twitter at Jess Birkin. We want to hear from you. Send us a message at our website, charitytherapy.show. And don't forget to subscribe to our newsletter at birkinlaw.com/sign-up. Charity Therapy is a production of Birkin Law Office, PLLC. Our theme song is by Whalehawk. And remember, folks, this podcast is produced for your entertainment and is not a substitute for actual legal advice.